But first, tonight, a weakened Prime Minister Anthony Albanese finally does the right thing and calls a royal commission into anti-Semitism. Now, finally, 25 days after the horror that unfolded at Bondi Beach, the Prime Minister has done what everybody has been begging him to do: call a royal commission.
It's clear to me that a royal commission is essential. Today I announced that I will be recommending to the Governor-General in an Executive Council meeting that will be held tomorrow that a royal commission on anti-Semitism and social cohesion be established. Dennis Richardson's work will become part of the commission, and he will support its work with delivery of an interim report by the commission in April.
Well, you know, that's all very well and good, but let's put what he has done in perspective and consider the politics of this announcement that came after weeks and weeks of cries, not only from Jewish groups, but business leaders, legal organizations, sporting fraternities, religious bodies, and civil society. What an unnecessary delay. And speaking of delays, it is remarkable to consider the reversal of fortune suffered by Anthony Albanese. Remember, in early 2025, he also delayed something. He delayed what was expected to be an April election. But that was in order to give himself space to lead the country through Cyclone Alfred's landfall and aftermath. When he did that delaying, he did so from a position of strength. Back then, Albanese looked like a man taking charge of events. And when Australians finally went to the polls in May, the Prime Minister won a thumping parliamentary majority, helped in no small part, it must be said, by a rudderless opposition campaign. But as we launch now into 2026, Albanese is leading from a position of weakness, having foolishly delayed for weeks his ultimately inevitable decision to launch a royal commission into the Bondi Beach terror attack. Poleaxed by the massacre and facing the wrath of a Jewish community which felt ignored after more than 2 years of rabid anti-Semitism, harassment, arson attacks, doxing, and worse, Albanese presumably hoped that the demands for a royal commission would peter out over the summer holidays. Well, as we all know now, he was wrong. And now Anthony Albanese appears to have done the right thing finally after, as Winston Churchill once said of the United States, after exhausting all the other options. And yet, though, despite this, let's give him some credit. There is some room for hope from this process. The best thing that can be said about the Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion announced by the Prime Minister is that it finally answers the calls, not just, as I say, from the Jewish community, but from the majority of Australians who believe that the most terrible assault on our way of life at Bondi Beach demands only the highest level of response from the government. And to be fair, there are other things here that I think we should be thankful for. Albanese acknowledged, for one, that the attacks were, again, not just on the Jewish community, but on the Australian way of life. This is a key point, I think, that needs to be underlined time and time again to ensure that the fight against anti-Semitism is not seen as a niche concern, but something which affects us all. And while the devil may be in the details, the key areas for the Royal Commission announced by Albanese are more promising than I had worried.
1. Tackling anti-Semitism by investigating the nature and prevalence of anti-Semitism, examining its key drivers in Australia, including religious and ideologically motivated extremism and radicalisation. 2. Making any recommendations to assist law enforcement, border control, immigration and security agencies to tackle anti-Semitism, including through improvements to guidance and training within law enforcement, border control, immigration and security agencies to respond to anti-Semitic conduct. 3. Examine the circumstances surrounding the Bondi terrorist attack on the 14th of December 2025, and the work of Dennis Richardson will be central to this. And 4, make any other recommendations arising out of the inquiry for strengthening social cohesion in Australia and countering the spread of ideological and religiously motivated extremism in Australia.
So, all in all, that is frankly better than it could have been. One thing that people were concerned about did not happen. There will be no simultaneous inquiry into Islamophobia, which, among other things, suggests the Labour government has finally learned its lesson from seeming to create false equivalencies while pandering to large Muslim voting blocs in Labour-held seats. As well, it was very important that the question of immigration got an explicit mention in those terms of reference, which is only fair given that jihadism that appears to have inspired the alleged attackers is indeed an entirely imported ideology. And indeed also, simply large amounts of immigration are doing quite a bit to strain social cohesion. I mean, when people can't afford a house or to rent an apartment because they feel like they're being priced out by a growing population, well, that's also a way in which immigration can, yes, harm social cohesion. Yet, at the same time, there are reasons I have deep concerns about this process, because that term social cohesion I just mentioned, that's a woolly one. And certainly Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke did his part to undermine the hoped-for unity of all this talk of social cohesion when he took a cheap shot at the opposition in today's press conference.
Some of the terms of reference that had been floated around, in particular from the opposition in recent weeks, would have left something that gave us no answers for a very long time, would not have had the expertise of someone like a national security expert like Dennis Richardson, and also would have failed to have the priority of social cohesion in the structure that's been given here.
How tasteless. And as the press conference was going on, I could only wonder what the Prime Minister was thinking about there when the Home Affairs Minister, Tony Burke, wound up, as I say, undermining that call for unity. But, I suppose Tony Burke now knows that after all of this, he will never be Prime Minister, and maybe he was just acting out. Well, poor Diddums. But if the Royal Commission is to be genuine about this idea of social cohesion, then it must, as I say, look at every area of life where social cohesion has been weakened and where anti-Semitism has been allowed to take root, including Labour strongholds in their constituencies in the arts industry and in academia, where anti-Semitism is rife. And even it must also look at the Prime Minister's office itself, which was warned repeatedly about anti-Semitism, the rising tide of Jew hatred, and the danger that this posed to all of this, but which decided to ignore those warnings and as a result was caught flat-footed. Now, there's other questions too. Another one is staffing. Depending on how this commission is staffed and what its terms of reference, what the final terms of reference turn out to be, we could also wind up saying the worst things about it, namely that it was a politically engineered stitch-up designed to quell community anger, but which fails in its primary mission. And what is that mission? Well, it is to prevent a replay of the horrors of December 14. And finally, of course, there are concerns about the commissioner herself, former High Court Justice Virginia Bell. And while Bell is well regarded as a jurist, she is also a progressive who has a long history in so-called progressive legal circles, having worked at the Redfern Legal Centre and for the Royal Commission into the New South Wales Police in the 1990s. She was also the judge who replaced Michael Kirby on the High Court and was appointed by Kevin Rudd, which have an awful lot of people concerned, including people in the Jewish community. And among their greatest concerns is that Bell was part of a High Court ruling that struck down Tasmanian laws about political protest in a case that later became precedent for the decision that allowed pro-Palestine demonstrators to march disgracefully, I might add, across the Harbour Bridge last year. Even more pertinently, she has zero in the way of national security experience. There are other pitfalls, too, and as I mentioned before, staffing is a big one. How this commission is ultimately staffed will have a big impact on how its investigations proceed and what its final outcome is. Labor, of course, is going to be tempted to revert to form and staff it with counsel and lawyers connected to the ALP, much in the same way Labor stacks out bureaucracies and benches whenever it is in power. But if the government is true to the ideal of letting the commission go where it will, letting the facts fall where they may, they must resist this temptation and instead staff the investigation with lawyers and experts with real criminal law and national security expertise.